Okay, looks like everyone's here. We're a couple more coming through the door. We'll go ahead and get started. If you ever want to welcome or comment, we're glad that you're taking an interest in Lake Mitchell and what we're planning to do to improve the water quality conditions there in the lake. Tonight, we want to make sure all your questions are answered and that you provided your input to fire us. So there will be plenty of opportunity for that tonight. And we want to make sure you don't leave here without any unanswered questions, and make sure you get those answered. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize a few people that are here. Mayor Toomey, if you just stand up real quick. All right, thank you. City councilors, there's over here, if you could just stand up real quick. Thank you. And if you're on the Watershed Advisory Committee or the Technical Advisory Team or on the Lake Committee, if you can just quickly stand up so people can recognize who you are. All right, thank you. So tonight we have fire presenting to you. They were chosen by the Lake Committee to provide solutions to improve water quality in Lake Mitchell. And they are a water resource firm that restores lakes and they restore streams, and that's what they're here to do, to help us improve and restore Lake Mitchell. So today we have Mike Sotek here. He's going to go ahead and introduce his team, and they'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. As Nathan said, my name is Mike Sotek. I'm one of the people talking to you tonight. And I want to introduce also, first seat here is Dr. Charles Eichenberry. He's a water quality specialist here. He runs our Des Moines office. He's got a long history, a PhD in water quality, lake restoration. Next to him is Sarah Mechtenberg, who has worked with me for the better part of her professional career, unfortunately for her, and she does a lot of the Lions work of the Watershed Modeling, et cetera, that we're here. And then you'll see on the front page of the technical memorandum that we added Verax here. And so this is Dr. Greg Kipp, who's at the very end of the table here, who's the owner of Verax. And the reason that came about is that one of the big parts of this latest effort has been the fact that what we found was that a lot of the phosphorus that's entering Lake Mitchell is in the form of dissolved phosphorus. And so that creates some unique challenges that we're going to talk about tonight. The biggest differentiator between that is the project that we're kind of used to working with throughout the Midwest, which is what we call sediment-attached phosphorus. You take care of the sediment, you take care of the phosphorus. Well, this is a little bit of a different case here in the James Loeb, South Dakota, and therefore the dissolved phosphorus creates some challenges at Lake Mitchell that are pretty untypical of a lot of the projects that have undergone restoration projects in the Midwest. So once that data started coming, we understood that. We've worked with Greg on other lake restoration projects in the past. He's got expertise in geochemistry that you'll find out by the end of the night what his specialty is. And so at the very end, we added him to the project, and he's been instrumental in the development of this TM and the path forward. So a little bit of the ground rules for tonight. What we're going to do real quick is we've got a lot of information here. We've taken the technical memorandum, and if you did take the chance to read that, there's a lot of technical jargon in there, a lot of basis for the solutions and what we did. We're not going to go into as deep as the TM did as far as the technical memorandum tonight. We're going to try to talk more just in terms of a clear path of what we learned and why we're proposing to go where we're going. And so during that, what I would say is that if you have a question along the way, there's a chance we might get to it later. In fact, let me show you real quick the scope of the night. These are the things that we're going to talk about, if you want to take a look at that. And so we're going to get to a lot of it eventually. But what I would tell you is, and Charles does a good job of saying this, is that if something's stuck in your mind and you really can't get past it, just stop me and let's talk about it then. And let's just get the question answered. On the other hand, at the end of the presentation, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to, number one, take questions from the general attendance here. If you got a question you think everybody wants to hear, that you don't mind public speaking, and stand up and ask that question, by all means, stand up and ask that question. Then what we're going to do is we're going to break out into 2 rooms so that you can have a little bit more one-on-one time. And Sarah and I are going to stay right here. We're going to talk about funding and next steps. And then Dr. Eichenberry, Dr. Kidd, we're going to go right across the hall there in room 111. They're going to talk about modeling, geochemistry. Anybody has questions about some of the specifics of that, you can go in there and have a chance to work with them one-on-one as well. So that's kind of how we're going to do things. In the back of the room there, near the board that's standing up there, this is Anna Petro, who works with us. Raise your hand. Hi, Anna. There you go. So she can help you there. Raise your hand if you'd like her to bring you a comment card to jot some questions down. We got a box up there. If you want to jot down any questions that you don't want to ask in public, put them in there. We'll be happy to get back to everybody and answer those as part of the overall process here. And then we'll go forward from there. So I'll repeat all that at the end of the general presentation. Otherwise, I'm going to get going. All right, so this is a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight here, just as far as an agenda of how things go. So what I'm going to first hit on is when we talk about the project scope. So when we came, and I don't know if you know this, but we came to Lake Mitchell. Sarah here has a cousin in town who lives in Mitchell, so she comes up here occasionally and talks about what she does at the family dinner. And the cousin said, you know, our lake isn't in very good shape. You know, why don't you come up here and talk to us? We did a little research and found out that, you know, not only was it in great shape, but it was pretty bad shape. And we actually went and contacted the city and started with Mayor Toomey and came up and said, you know, we understand you're having some struggles. This is what we do for a living. Is there anything we can do to help? And I think over the period of about 15, 16 months, back and forth, chit-chatting about what we thought could be done, we started this study. And this study, and so our company believes, in terms of successful lake management, there's 7 steps you ought to do. And that's what's listed here is these 7 steps. This particular effort that we've done so far takes care of the first 3. We've identified what the problem is. We developed, and that was the main push of this particular effort, is let's develop a water and nutrient mass balance model. Because without that model, we believe it's difficult to predict lake response. And so we can sit here and talk about all these different things you can do to help a lake, and things have been successful in other places. But if you really don't know how the lake's going to respond from a scientific standpoint, it's tough to evaluate the potential success of those alternatives. So we built a lot of a computer model that's been very accurate in terms of predicting the past, in terms of historical, what we call model calibration, and we hope that it's also helpful in predicting where we're going to go in the future there. The last one there is the load and response modeling. So we look at the information for the mass balance model, what's coming into the lake and what's going out, and then number 3 is how's the lake going to respond. And so throughout all of these steps, we have what we call the community-based planning effort. And so that's involving not only the public, but also different committees. Watershed Advisory Committee, which is made up mostly of interested citizens, and also a technical advisory team, which Sarah's going to talk about the functions and roles over what those provide. And so we actually started that process. That process is always intended to work through the entire alternative screening and design analysis process. And so that's what we've been working on as well. So this was, in essence, the scope of this project. And so what we made very clear at the beginning of this thing is that for what we're going to do in the next year, over the last year, we're not going to come out of here and know exactly what it's going to take here. But what we're going to be able to do is answer something you haven't been able to answer in the past, and that's what kind of project are we looking at here? Are we talking about a $2 million project? Are we talking about a $20 million project? Are we talking about a $200 million project? When we started this, no one really knew the answer to that. And so what we've done now is drill down on that a little bit, and we're going to talk about how we can kind of further drill down on that in the past or in the near future here. So on the left here is the technical memorandum for the cover sheet of that and what's been developed here. And then on the city's webpage, actually, there's a link here, and you can actually download the draft of the TM. We call it a draft because we believe it's always a work in progress. There's more work to do, and so some of the information in here is the best, well, all the information here is the best information we have today. It doesn't mean we aren't going to learn something in the next year. Should you decide to keep moving forward with the lake project, doesn't mean we're not going to learn something that makes our findings, we can fine tune those or maybe even change them a little bit, who knows. But we think we've drilled down to the level where we know what the next key steps are, and we're going to talk about that. So if you ever want to see, the full page report there, that's where you find it on the city's website. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah and talk about some of the history here.
Hello. So when we started out, one of the first things we wanted to do was really make sure we understood what has been done in the watershed and in the lake over time. We wanted to make sure we understood the actions that has been taken and the studies that have been done so that we aren't repeating work that's already been done, and so we can learn from the successes and failures and really educate ourselves on how this lake has been functioning in the past. So looking at our timeline, you can see there's been a lot of studies on this lake. They started with quantity. Do we have enough quantity for drinking water? But eventually, 1985, reports start coming out where the focus turns to water quality. And then you start seeing some action being taken. And in 1997, there was a very good, very detailed diagnostic feasibility study that really set up a lot of the work that was done in the watershed through a 319 implementation plan. So there was about 12 years of implementation of work in the watershed, trying to get some nutrient load reductions in the watershed, as well as about in 2002, I think you guys are all familiar with the alum demonstration projects that took place on the lake. So we really got into those reports, really read about the results and the design of those applications so we could educate ourselves. But after all of that, we are still here in 2017, and the concentrations in our lake, in your lake, are still pretty high, and that's, we put it modestly. So even after all that work, we are still up to this point now where we're beginning our 7 steps. So we have our average phosphorus and chlorophyll A concentrations, and chlorophyll A is a measure, primarily it's a way of measuring the algae content in your lake. So you can see we have an average for over the past 20 years or so, and then the most recent year shows that there is an increasing trend that's occurring. So then we get into our investigations and modeling, and there's a lot of information out there, like I said, so we started pulling the data that we can use and start implementing into our model. So this is just a list about all the data we have, watershed and lake, quality and quantity. And this list lays it out, and it shows that the more data you have, the more accurate your models can be. So once we get all of that organized and usable, we start our modeling, and that's when Charles comes into play.
So one of the best tools we had at our disposal was a water budget and a mass balance model. And really the goal of this tool is to really quantify and understand all the different pathways through which both water and nutrients, in our case we're primarily concerned with phosphorus, are either entering the lake or leaving the lake, or in some cases cycling up and down within the lake. So that's the purpose of the water budget and the mass balance model. The first thing we have to do is to be able to understand and quantify the movement of water in and out of the lake. If we can't do that, we're going to be hard pressed to really understand the phosphorus dynamics, and from there getting even more complex into the algal growth and things like that. So we want to be able to simulate water volume or water level, and then of course phosphorus flows to the lake, and ultimately phosphorus concentrations in the lake as the primary nutrient that drives algal growth. And so some of the key pathways that we're talking about, of course, for water include precipitation directly over the surface of the lake, flow in from the watershed through Firesteel Creek, and some adjacent runoff from the land immediately surrounding the lake. And some lakes have a very large groundwater inflow, other lakes have a smaller groundwater inflow, so we had to get a handle on that as well. And then of course in the past there had been some historical pumping from the James River into Lake Mitchell, so that is also reflected in our water budget model. On the flip side, water leaving the lake includes things like evaporation from the water surface, pumping out for irrigation or for use, and obviously flow over the outlet structure, and then potential seepage, groundwater seepage out of the lake. Most of those pathways also, they're not just clean water, obviously, or we wouldn't be here. They have a different chemical characteristic, different pollutants. Some things aren't pollutants, some things are, but primarily, again, phosphorus is what we're interested here, that's coming in and out with those different pathways. And then, of course, within the lake, you see that gray circle there, we have phosphorus coming in from the watershed. Some of that settles down to the bottom of the lake. It hangs out there until an opportune time comes along for it to be released back up into the water column where it can drive algal growth. So those are the primary pathways for water and phosphorus that we need to get a handle on. And so Sarah already talked about a lot of the data that was at our disposal. We have pumping records, and also we can estimate irrigation, both, and then verify that with pumping records, historical pumping records. We have water quality data in Firesteel Creek and in the lake itself, as well as some smaller local efforts. And so we provide all that data, and that's all what's behind the modeling and the assessment that comes next. This plot shows the lake water surface elevation over the last, going back to 1990 or so. The blue dots that you see are times when someone went out there physically to the lake and measured the water level. The green line that you see there, that horizontal green line, I'm going to use this thing, we've got it sitting up here. This green line here, that reflects the elevation of the spillway. So anything above that green line, that means the lake is flowing out. There's water flowing out of the lake. When the lines or the dots are below that, we've got low water conditions in the lake. So the red line there that's plotted through those blue dots, that is the model's predicted water surface elevation. So you can see with a few exceptions, it does a good job of reflecting the water surface elevation of the lake, therefore it's predicting the volume of water in the lake very well. There's one spot that's a little bit problematic, which was troubling to me, back here in 98, 99, where the red line doesn't follow the blue dots very well. That's, if you recall, those of you that were around at that time, that's when they did some repair work and some modification on the spillway of the lake. So that's an artificial blip there in the blue dots. So that's not a model problem, that's just that the lake was not functioning naturally at that point. Water was backed up for a reason, so they could work on the spillway. So the water balance model was deemed good enough to move forward now into predicting water concentrations, nutrients in the water column. So what you see here is, again, and these are, the nice thing about this model is that it's dynamic. So it's operating on a short time scale. So every day it's predicting water level and a phosphorus concentration in the lake. So here again, the dots are illustrating observed phosphorus concentrations in the water column of Lake Mitchell, and the red line there are the predicted concentrations by the mass balance model. You might notice a lot of the data points are clustered in the early 2000s. And as Sarah noted, that's when a lot of the previous effort was undertaken on the lake. So it makes sense when you're actively working on the lake, you're collecting data, and then you can see those years after that initial, it seems to be related to that Allen demonstration project. Those years subsequent to that, we don't have as much data to work with. So we really tried to drive our model calibration to those periods of time where we have that. So that's just part of the model calibration there, so we can see how it responds to all those different water and nutrient pathways that we talked about. Now, between the model, which was driven by observed flow and observed water quality data, we know the total load to the lake, or have a pretty good estimate of that, just based on the observed data and some pretty simple and straightforward calculations. What we don't have as good a handle on is where is it coming from throughout the watershed. So that's where Sarah did a lot of work with a watershed model of the lake. Again, in the end, it agrees with the data that was collected in the watershed in the lake, but we have to have some way of targeting management strategies or practices to improve water quality.
Did you show where the lake is and where the watershed is?
Absolutely.
People have an idea.
And yeah, does everybody know when we say watersheds, maybe we should just take a step back. So what a watershed is really just a drainage area. It's an area of land where precipitation falls somewhere in the landscape. It's going to drain to a certain point. That area that drains to a certain point, in this case Lake Mitchell, is its watershed. So this red line here, anything that falls in that, in terms of rainfall, is going to make its way to Lake Mitchell. That's the watershed. And this little blue, that's Lake Mitchell. So the watershed is about 375,000 acres, depending on which source of historical information you want to use, and the lake is about 700 acres. So it's a ratio of 500 to 1, and a lot of you on the WAC and the TAP are very familiar with that issue. We're going to talk about the implications that that has for the lake.
Does all that water off of that watershed go into Firestill Creek yet? Are there other tributaries that feed into the lake?
There are, so predominantly in this case, all the major tributaries come together about right here, and from there on in, it's mostly flowing through Firestill Creek. There's of course a little bit of area adjacent to the lake that does not enter a major stream. So there's some small drainage area that makes its way to the lake, not through Firestill Creek. But the vast, vast majority is through Firestill.
There is a drainage area that extends several miles to the west on the south side of Firestill.
There's one small trip.
Yeah.
Right, yes,
Several
yeah.
thousand acres.
Yeah, I believe that the Firestill, the mouth of Firestill
That
Creek,
that
right
enters
enters
the
the lake.
lake of Firestill Creek, so that would bypass Firestill Creek and go directly into the lake, right?
Yes, I think Firestill Creek at its mouth, that's about 85 to 90% of the watershed at least. So, good question. All right, so I defined the watershed probably a few slides later than I should have, but with the watershed modeling, we want to look at all the different sources in the landscape that could be providing water and nutrients to the lake. So you have things in a generalized sense. This is not specific to Lake Mitchell, but you've got things like urban runoff, you've got potentially wastewater treatment plants, you have things happening in the agricultural landscape that contribute water and nutrients to the lake in this case. So we want to define all those things, kind of do an inventory, if you will. And so what's really important here are soils and soil types, land use or land cover. What's the topography like? How steeply sloped are different areas of the watershed? What are the weather patterns like, specifically precipitation? How intense is the rainfall? How much rainfall do you get? And then other things that are, again, just part of that inventory. How many livestock? What type of livestock? Where are they located? How close to the stream are they? Those kinds of things. Having that information, there are some general relationships that are developed out there by agencies such as the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, that helps us identify and quantify spatial estimates of loading, phosphorus loading in this case, from the watershed. So that's what you see here. We have broken down into different types of land uses, which include urban, cropland, pasture, some timbered areas, just so on and so forth. We don't want to get too mired down that. Again, plenty of time to ask questions about anything if you have those specific questions. But the main thing here is that on a per acre basis, the amount of phosphorus coming from the watershed is relatively low. That's on a per acre basis. But the problem is that the watershed is so large that it ends up being a lot of phosphorus. The cumulative effect of that phosphorus is quite large getting to the lake. So it's kind of a good news, or maybe it's a bad news, good news, bad news scenario. The red and pink shaded map there, those indicate where, on a per acre basis, some of the higher phosphorus loads are coming on off of the watershed. So that can be helpful in trying to locate practices. We want to locate practices and implement strategies where we can have the most bang for the buck and catch the most phosphorus. So that's the purpose of that information. Another interesting finding here, which is also kind of a good news, bad news thing, Mike touched on it earlier, there's a relatively low sediment yield from this watershed as well. And we know that not only because of our analysis and our work and the data that we were able to collect and also take an inventory of, but also some of the historical studies note this over and over again. We see that noted in the historical studies. What we haven't talked about much yet, and we talked about the watershed, but the internal load, again, is very important. That internal load is that amount of phosphorus that has come into the lake historically. It's sitting there hanging out in the bottom of the lake, and at some point it's available for release up into the water column. This is one of the more difficult things to quantify in any lake restoration effort. So what you see here, going back a few years, this runs from about 2001 to 2013, that red bar chart there. Those are the estimates for internal loading every year. So on average, we're finding that internal phosphorus loading to the water column could be providing up to half of the total phosphorus load to the water column. So we have to address both the internal load as well as what's coming in from the watershed. If you don't do both, it's going to be we're going to be hard pressed to make any significant progress. Now, internal loading is very complex, so I'm gonna bring Greg up here at this point, and he's gonna explain internal loading to us in a simple way.
Great, thank you, Charles. As Mike mentioned, I'm new to the team and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you late. But I'm an old hat at South Dakota Geology. I grew up in the state and I've been studying our geology for about 30 years now. So I'm very familiar with how things work in the state. And I'm going to try to make this very complicated spaghetti looking like diagram a lot simpler by using a couple of kind of household or common analogies. And the simplest one that I can think of is thinking of the lake bed as being like a sponge, right? When the water column has a lot of phosphorus in it, think of that like dirt. If you've got dirty water and a sponge, right? The sponge, if the sponge is cleaner than the water, that sponge is going to soak up dirt. And your lake bed is the same way. If there's a lot of phosphorus in the water column, more than what's in the lake bed, that lake bed is, the sediments are going to soak up phosphorus. And they use a variety of mechanisms that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But the reverse happens if the water is cleaner in the water column and we have a dirty lake bed. Just like a dirty sponge, that sponge can make clean water dirty because it'll release it. And so there's a balance between the lake bed and the water that becomes very important in understanding how phosphorus is loaded within the lake and how it drives algal blooms and other water quality issues. This really complicated piece here we can get into a little more detail in the breakout session. I'm certainly happy to discuss things, but I want to turn to another algorithm or another analogy, and that's parking lots. If you ever go to the airport in Sioux Falls, you know, you've got different parking strategies. You can do curbside drop-off, you can do short-term parking, you can do long-term parking, and phosphorus is kind of like that. When I say that it absorbs the minerals in the lake sediments, you can think of those as being parking spots, where phosphorus is a vehicle and it needs to find some place in that lake bed to deposit. And there's a couple of different types of parking lots or different long-term and short-term storages that become important for how phosphorus is either stored or released to the lake bed. One of the most important is iron. And there's a couple of different types of iron that are important. And this is one thing that really distinguishes Lake Mitchell from just about any other lake that people have been working on and trying to clean things up. So folks that have tried to study this lake using some of those older algorithms or those older type of methods can run into problems if we don't consider different types of iron that are out there. So ferric iron, which is the Fe3+ iron, that's like rust on your car. It's a rusty color, oxidized iron. And you can see that in sediments that have been exposed, you know, occasionally run into ground sediments. Ferrous has a black color. So if you've ever stepped into a wetland or, you know, muck, you know what ferrous iron looks like. That's what colors the black soils. What's usually considered is the ferric iron, because it takes about one phosphorus can occupy about 10 to 15 ferric ions. And that's the normal thing that we look at, because when the lake becomes anoxic in most settings, that phosphorus is going to become released. But Lake Mitchell has so much phosphorus that it can form ferrous phosphate minerals. They're basically salts. And that's what makes Lake Mitchell so much different than, say, somebody studying a Minnesota lake or a Michigan lake or wherever. And we probably have millions of pounds of phosphorus tied up in the lake bed in a variety of different salts that can dissolve under different conditions or precipitate when the phosphorus is high. And that material has been getting stored for 90 years out of the watershed. And this is one of the reasons that the lake that was constructed in 1927 enjoyed pretty decent water quality for the first couple of generations. But after a while, it just filled up so much with phosphorus that the internal loading of the dirty sponge that is releasing phosphorus back to the lake bed becomes a very important issue. Another part is the calcium, and that's usually more of a long-term parking spot. The phosphorus tends to be sequestered there for a significant amount of time. And there's a couple versions of calcium precipitation. One is calcite, and that's like chocolates. You literally have calcite in your lake sediments. And then the other one is various forms of apatite, and we all have apatite in our mouth. Literally, our teeth, our bones are made of apatite, and that phosphorus-bearing salt forms in the lake there as well. And then there's phosphorus that's tied up in organic matter. Some of that is short-term, and some of that is long-term. And then there's phosphorus that binds up with aluminum, and that tends to be a very long-term and stable source of sequestration. But we have gotten to the point in Lake Mitchell, after 90 years of floating, where that lake bed is full. The parking garage is completely full of phosphorus. And at this point, if that's not contemplated in the lake management strategies, it's going to be very difficult to have success with any remediation strategy.
One more unique part of the puzzle here in Lake Mitchell and its watershed, again, and Mike touched on this as well right up front, is we have a high amount of dissolved phosphorus coming in from the lake. A lot of times in a lot of lakes, you're dealing with highly erodible soils, maybe highly cultivated soils, steep slopes. So we see a lot of sediment attached phosphorus. We see a lot of erosion. And you can see erosion driving down the road. But what we have in this watershed is kind of the opposite case. We've got a lot of dissolved phosphorus that's not attached to sediment, that's making its way through the watershed and to the lake. And actually about 2/3 of the phosphorus entering the lake is in dissolved form. And so that impacts water quality, because that is a highly preferred form of phosphorus for plant growth, algae growth in the case of the lake. But it also affects the types of solutions that are at our disposal. We can't go out into the watershed and simply do a lot of no-till and sediment ponds, those kinds of things. They're not going to be as effective in this watershed as they might in a watershed where we have high erosion. So we wanted to make sure we pointed that out as well. The other thing is that phosphorus concentration in the stream increases as flow increases. And you can see that there on the left side of the graph. You have high flow conditions, you have higher dissolved phosphorus concentrations, and that tends to then sag in the middle as you have more normal flows or even low flows. Under some very low flows, we have high concentrations again. There could be a number of reasons for that, but I don't want to get too sidetracked with that. I'm happy to talk about that later. It's not all that important for the lake, because so much water is coming during high flow and wet flow conditions. We have higher concentrations there that about 90% of the phosphorus entering the lake comes in about 35 to 40 days a year on average. So you get 90% of your phosphorus with the highest 10% or so of flow events. Another interesting thing about this watershed is that despite its size, it has a very low watershed yield. There's about 25,000 acre-feet entering the watershed through Firesteel Creek every year. But the storage in the lake at the elevation of the outflows of the lake is about 8,500 acre-feet. So what that means is the average residence time that a particle of water spans in the lake is about 120 days. So what that means is that lake is essentially filling up and refilling, or emptying out and refilling about 3 times a year. So that also has impacts on potential strategies. So now we're going to get to the fun part, and Sarah's going to start to introduce, what do we do about this?
So this is how I feel, maybe it's how you're feeling. A lot of the times when I get information back from Charles and Kip and working with them along the way, there's a lot to process and so many different paths you can go down. And really, so we like to kind of take a step back with all this data and make sure that we start in a place that is acceptable to the community. So as Mike referred to in the beginning, that parallel track along these steps is the community-based planning portion of the project. And so at the very beginning, we formed 2 committees, and they've already been highlighted here in the early stages, but we formed a watershed council, which is formed of public citizens, as well as a technical advisory team. And they've been very informative in helping us understand more of the specific, ways that things work up in your watershed. Every watershed is a little bit different. They've been good at giving us, insight on the practices that take place in the watershed and information that we can use in our models, and also when we start formulating our strategies and what types of practices are going to be accepted to the community, what are going to be maybe have some more resistance, and what are common practices that people tend to favor. And so with that, it was very informative having those relationships throughout this process. And in the beginning, we started out simple with goals. What do you want your lake to look like? No hard numbers really were set at that point in time, but basic premises, you want less algal blooms, less public health warnings, increased clarity on your lake. And so really, what does that mean in terms of numbers and where we're sitting? So these averages, these total phosphorus concentration averages in your lake, in order to have more desirable water quality like we discussed, algae blooms, the phosphorus concentrations, we need to get back onto the chart. So what does that mean? Concentrations we're sitting at, we're currently 800s, 900s, almost 1,000 at times. We need to be bringing these concentrations back orders of magnitude down to roughly anywhere between 60 and 80 micrograms per liter is generally when you can start having less algae blooms, increased water clarity. So we are really fighting an uphill battle at this lake, and the strategies that we've started to look at are trying to look at really big pictures and what's the magnitude of the effort that it's going to take to get there. And so when we started looking at these things, all that information, we needed to start compartmentalizing how we approach this. And then we brought it down into 3 different categories. The Inline Solutions that we developed focus on treating that internal load that Kip and Charles referred to. What can you do in the lake? I mean, that's a 700-acre lake, but it's producing almost as much of a load as that entire 300,000+ acre watershed. So it's a very concentrated load that we have to start addressing. We came up with a set of inlet strategies to try to look at those. Now, oftentimes we just split this into 2 categories, in-lake and watershed. But we added this near-lake one in because these are the types of large-scale solutions that the city could potentially tackle on their own. Watershed-based solutions, conservation efforts are we want to promote those. They'll do, but like Charles said, small loads spread across large areas. They're a lot harder for you as a city to try to tackle on your own. But large-scale near-lake solutions is a new category we set aside to try to help you give you guys some control over how to manage your lake. So the inline solutions that we considered, there's a long list of different approaches you can take. Dredging focuses on removal of sediments. So there's a couple different ways dredging can be used. You can dredge to try to increase volume. Sort of the dilution is the solution to pollution. So that's one approach with dredging. Another approach with dredging is to scoop up and excavate out those sediments that are holding all of that phosphorus that Kim talked about. So that would be a very widespread skimming of the lake bottom to try to get those out of the lake. So those are 2 sort of different approaches you can take with dredging. Shallow vegetation management is an attempt at modifying lake levels to try to increase vegetation, aquatic vegetation that would compete with algae. So that's one way it doesn't really reduce your pollutant load, but it acts as in competition with algae. Lake segmentation, generally not a popular one when there's homes on the lake. You can segment it and try to maybe somewhat sacrifice a portion of the lake and use it as a trap for some of the phosphorus, which I don't think that would have a lot of favorable reception at this point in time. Hypolimitic aeration withdrawals. Those focus on the high concentrations of phosphorus that are experienced due to the internal loading. Those are some methods of trying to remove and reduce those concentrations. Phosphorus inactivation is, you guys may be familiar with it from the whole lake alum approach. There's other methods, other chemicals that can be used rather than aluminum sulfate that has been used in the past. But that's basically, I guess I can let Tim and Charles get into the chemistry of that more, but it's basically binding those sediments on the lake bed, prevent that internal load from continuing to reintroduce back into the water column. And then there's a couple of algae harvesting, pumping from the James River, a couple other things you can look at to try to change the conditions of the lake. This set of near lake alternatives, like we said, individually, they may not give us the bang for the buck that we're looking for, but collectively, they could combine into an interesting system to treat the watershed load. I'm not going to get into the specific details of each and every one of these yet. I'm going to let Mike do that, but basically, I think you guys have heard of, learned about our bypass system that would, the premise basically is to not allow that dirty water from the watershed to enter the lake, or sort of find a way to get it around the lake. I mean, if there's a large load coming in, and this was where we got a little bit creative and tried to think of ways to prevent that loading from reaching the lake. And then the others are some treatment methods that we looked at, that I'll let Mike get into the details of that in a little bit. And then also watershed-based solutions. I think we're all very familiar with conservation practices that can happen in the watershed. Anything you can do in the watershed to reduce the nutrient loading that ultimately reaches the lake. Again, it's a very widespread effort, but there's lots of cost share and programs already set up for doing that. In the past, you guys have had a watershed coordinator to try to focus those activities, and that might be something you want to pursue again. So livestock management, that's always a large one too. There's quite a bit of animals in your watershed as well as croplands. So either tackling both of those and reducing the pollutants from ever being produced in the first place is a good place to start as
well. So Sarah began to hit on some of those, and when we talk about these strategies here, ultimately what we want to do is, and I've clipped in a little bit of a graph here, and Charles talked a little bit about this earlier here, but we're trying to get to the point where that blue line is in that neighborhood of the range that Sarah was talking about, where we're trying to get to the point where those blue dots are below there. And you talk about that scale, that's kind of in normal lakes, just normal chemistry. There's a lot of things that affect algal growth, a lot of environmental factors, weather, humidity, wind, a lot of things that you can't control. We're just trying to say for the simple things that we're looking at in the model, we want to be able to find solutions that bring those blue dots down below that light blue line. So as you can see, there's some work ahead of us. So how do we do that? How do we get to the point where we can show that we can get those reduced there? So I'm going to take personal responsibility for some of the confusion that was caused early on when we talked about some of these strategies. And so what our original intention was when we talked about those was to look at, as you can see, 3 geographic focuses. And so the community-based process, there's a lot of things, reasons why we talk about things in private, a lot of things why things go public. And there's appropriate times to disseminate information, and there's times that aren't so great to cause confusion. So I think we caused a little bit of confusion by nature of what we wanted to do. And so one of the things I wanted to add on to, Sarah talked about, one of the big reasons why we work with the Watershed Advisory Committee and also invite information from the public here is because there's technical solutions to problems, then there's social solutions to problems. Social solutions have everything to do with watershed versus lake users versus how do we pay for things. There's a lot of those things that don't involve all this, technical jargon that have to be decided. And quite honestly, all of you are better than us in terms of figuring those out. And so that WAC committee is that they're supposed to blend that. They're supposed to blend the public's input, the social inputs with the technical inputs to come up with a solution that A, meets goals and B, is affordable. And so all of those things collectively is what we're working on still, and still guiding towards a point. And so we're not trying to say, and so you've heard the story that there's a $6 million solution and there's an $81 million solution. Not true. That's not where that was going. That wasn't intended to be put out that way, and I'm going to hit on that a little bit more about that. But in a nutshell, we're looking at how do we blend some of those alternatives that Sarah talked about to get us to the point where we can drop those blue dots down below that blue line, the light blue line. So this is in the technical memorandum. And here's the section you see right here, section 7.5, page 58. So can you all, I know I stepped away from the mic a little bit. Can you all hear me okay when I do? I know you can probably hear me better, but on the next mic, I'll do my best. So what we've talked about here, and this is a bit of a strategy summary here. So we've gone through and we've kind of tried to lay out a process that we can get to where that is. How do we get to the point where we can get those blue dots down below that blue line and get to the point where we can have water quality that's going to start giving us some of those goals, start meeting some of those goals that we'd like to see with regards to nutrient reduction, and therefore not only the algae reduction, but also the microcystin, which is the bacteria that comes with blue green algae, that closes beaches, and the chlorophyll that creates the algae as well. And so what we're talking about here is we put together several things and talked about 3 different strategies here. And so in this, we've talked about a couple different points of this. And there's a lot of things that are important about each one of these strategies. There's number one, there's an initial investment in the strategy. And that's kind of the upfront capital costs. What does it cost us to get that on the ground? Then there's a description of that, and then there's a long-term investment, or you can think of it a little bit as operation and maintenance costs. And so operation and maintenance costs are important, especially in understanding why we're at where we're here today. So we've got a lake, and although you think, you've spent a lot of money in the past on this lake with those past studies, if you really look at the investment, you divide it over 90 years, we haven't really done that much. And just like us, as we get older, if we don't take care of our bodies, they get to the point where we're 90 years old where they aren't in good shape as we'd like them to be, or they could have been with that. And so I have a friend who made the comment once that, fixing a lake is like planting a tree. It's a great time to do it today, but it's an even better time 20 years ago. So we look back on what we've done. Should we have been saving a little bit more? Should we have been putting a little bit more into the lake? That's what drives that. So one of the things we all want to look at is also what's the operation and maintenance costs moving forward. No project you're going to do on a lake restoration project, certainly this one, is anything that's going to be one shot and done. There's no silver bullet. There's no, I can't do this and walk away and the lake's going to be good. So we've also tried to spell out what some of these other costs are here. And we got a little bit of description of the long-term costs there as well. And so I'm going to go through real quick. And so we looked at this. And so we talked about internal load control, and we talked about external loading to the project. You can take every ounce of phosphorus out of this watershed that comes down Firestone Creek or any other trip that isn't part of Firestone Creek. You can take every ounce of phosphorus out of the equation. You're going to still have algae problems. Because as we said, our load reduction, as Sarah said, scale and magnitude, when we're looking at trying to reduce our loading 80, 90%, and 50% comes from the watershed, we're still 30, 40 short, right? So we know as a minimum that we have to clean up the internal load. The internal load, as Greg said, has been collected for about 90 years now. It has a way of even exacerbating itself and making itself worse as time goes on, as we've seen. And so our first effort was saying, you could clean up that internal load there. One of the reasons, and then so what would that do? So what we're proposing as part of that is a dredging project that's probably the equivalent of about going in and although the sedimentation low, the sediments that are in there are very, very, very high phosphorus. And so one of the things we're talking about doing is going in and getting those off. We know that even with high watershed phosphorus, as Greg alluded to earlier, when the lake was first built, we still had good water quality for several generations, or at least acceptable, right? We might not call it good, we call it acceptable. And so we want to get back, we're confident we can get back to that point. So if we go get out and get those nasty phosphorus, that sediment that's sitting down there that's really putting a lot in, clean that up and get back to the original stuff, we can probably get to the point where we've got acceptable water quality as a start. But what does that mean? The next year, Sarah talked about the lake turns over 3 times a year. So the next year, when the spring rains come, our lake is not going to be full of polluted water again. That's polluted at a concentration that probably isn't going to be terribly acceptable to you. And so what do we do with that? So we've done this work and it's there. So that's kind of what some of the operation cost is that you could go in, if you only wanted to do this, clean up the internal load that's going to have a lifetime, that's going to have a term limit to it, and you could go in every spring right before the 4th of July, and you wanted a good lake, and you can apply alum to the lake again. Alum would work maybe that time a lot better than you've seen in the past. And so we're going to talk a little bit about alum, and when I say alum, I'm really talking about phosphorus inactivation. And so Greg and Charles can kind of expand on that a little bit later if you want. But alum gets something a bad name maybe in Mitchell because how it was used before. But there's probably some drawbacks to when the timing of when it was used and the fact of what the internal load situation was already when the alum was applied. Because you can strip the water column of alum, or you can use alum to strip the water column of phosphorus and clean it up. But that also almost makes it worse because what's going to be liberated from the internal load in the lake is almost going to make things worse. And that's probably pretty close to what happened before. But this strategy one just said if you went in and got rid of the loose sediments, put some alum down, got a control on it, you'd still have to come back every year and treat that water that's coming down through the watershed. Otherwise, you emptied your dirty bathtub and you filled it back up. And so we still got those high concentrations coming from the watershed. So that's kind of a strategy. It's not what I would call a sustainable strategy, but it's a way to get started. And there's also a lot of risk to that strategy too. And we're going to talk about the timing of risk and how we can prevent kind of you relying on annual things that I would call non-sustainable solutions. I'm going to get to that. So strategy 2 here has to do with near lake. And so we're going to propose a couple of solutions here to help look at, Sarah talked about the bypass detention. We're going to talk about a couple of solutions here that we think we can add on to that initial investment of cleaning up the lake at the bottom. We think we can do a couple things to help treat that water. Either treat it, delay it, retain it. There's a couple different things that can happen. We're going to talk about that. So that's going to end up costing a different bit of money here. And so we've got some stuff in here that needs to be, the design needs to be refined a little bit in terms of what the design is, and I'm going to talk about why that is there. The other part we talked about, the strategy, was working in the watershed. And one of the things we want to say is that we believe from this day forward, you should continue to do everything you can in the watershed. Everything we do to improve the quality of the water that comes from the watershed is going to help long-term to help reduce operation and maintenance costs for you. You're at the end of the pipe. And so what happens in the watershed, reducing nutrients. And so we think that one of the things we should do is keep working with the grassroots agencies like Ducks Unlimited, like Fences Forever. NRCS does a great job, EPA Section 319, and the Lower James River Watershed District. Keep working with everybody, do everything we can in the watershed to keep improving things. The problem is that we can't focus on a single solution in the watershed because, as you know, you've been working in the watershed for years, for decades. And the bottom line is that with what's coming down and what's already there in the internal load control, that you're simply not going to be able to see a change in Lake Mitchell in your lifetime. There's just no way, there's not enough money to get all that work done to be able to see a change in Lake Mitchell in your lifetime. And that's what we were asked to do is to meet goals, is also not to improve those goals, but how do we improve those goals in a manner where you all can enjoy the lake instead of your grandkids, in terms of working towards a sustainable solution. So we've said, please keep working in the watershed, please do everything you can, keep that progress going, that's going to be great for the project. But in terms of what you can control, what you can finance, and hopefully what you all get to see someday, it's not going to be enough to go out and make the changes to meet those goals that were established. So this is going to make a little bit more sense here in a minute, I think. So when we look at these different solutions here, and we talked about those 3 different strategies here, you can see on the left, and I'm sure the image isn't great, but you can see the red, which is the modeled, what's going to happen in the model solution. You can see the blue dots that kind of follow the same shapes. That's what that particular strategy does. And then you can probably barely see here, but it's a lot more evident. This is where it's at in the TM. You can look at the graph. But you can see that blue line kind of coming through the bottom here. You can see we're not below it all that often. And so by itself, it's not enough. And so what we've tried to do is look at if we just did internal control, if we did the near lake plus load control, And then if we looked at watershed work here. So this one here, the strategy 2, which involved not only internal load control, doing the in-lake stuff, but also doing some near-lake stuff, got us to the point where if we look at this line, we're below it. And so what this model shows is just, we just looked over the history for the past. This is 2003 and 2014, so 12 years, we just took historical stuff and said, what if we modeled this solution? What would it look like over those 12 years, where we've got a great set of data, okay? So this is the one that came the closest, but we still see there's still some risk in there. There's still some spikes when things can happen externally, floods, et cetera, big runoff events that just are going to work against your plan. But if you look collectively across the period, there's only spikes at certain times that are above it. Where we look at these other solutions, it's quite often above it. And so that's what we're working towards, is how do we build a project where we can get it down there for the most part of the year. And so now we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the next steps forward there. But with that also, we wanted to hit real quick on a lot of what I think some of the words that have been used are engineered solutions. There are many ways to engineer solutions. There are many ways to develop solutions based on science, but there are a lot of other things too. There are more natural solutions too that we try to consider in almost all of our lake projects. And so Greg's going to come up here and talk a little bit about some of those and how they would apply to Lake Mitchell.
Thanks, Greg. So one of the overarching themes that we need to think about for Lake Mitchell, when we compare it to other studies that have come from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, that's where a lot of the research has been done in those lake countries, but they have completely different geochemistry out there. So we need to think about Lake Mitchell from a South Dakota perspective and from an agriculture perspective. This large watershed, the geochemistry is completely different, which means we have to have different approaches. So some of the strategies that may be applied to different lakes, we could point to 1,000 lakes that have been remedied by applying alum. But in this lake, if we apply alum, and as Mike discussed, that's a phosphorus binding mechanism. Aluminum connects with the phosphorus and stably brings it to the bottom. The problem is the dirty sponge analogy, right? If we've got a dirty sponge down there and we clean the water column, that dirty sponge will see the clean water column and just release it right back. And you may get a few weeks of relief, but at a very high cost. So the first possible misconception is that alum alone can be feasible for a lake. Not this lake. You'd be looking at literally millions of pounds of alum, and just a jaw-dropping cost for that. The second misconception is sometimes you'll see folks offering to bring additives into the lake. I've heard crazy things, even like cactus juice. There's all kinds of folks out there that are offering different kinds of things that they'll call natural remedies, and give somebody an opportunity to try to sell a different remedy, whether it's herbs for your body or something for the lake, or you name it. It's out there. There's nothing on the market that I'm aware of that you can put into the lake that's going to make this lake behave. There just absolutely isn't, and I hate to see the city throw good money after that and such strategies. A third misconception is that aeration is going to bind up phosphorus and clean up the mud. There are lakes out east where that's going to work for you. If you've already got lower phosphorus levels, there's not a lot of that ferrous bound, the black iron bound phosphate like we have here. An aeration strategy could probably work. But in a lake like this, if we add air to that lake bed and oxygenate it all the way down to the bottom, that black iron is going to turn to rusty iron. The black iron has 1.5 black iron molecules can tie up a phosphorus. It takes 10 to 15 of them in the rusty form, right? So we're not making any progress if we turn our black iron that's very effective at binding phosphorus as a salt and shift it over to rusty iron. It will release literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds of phosphorus if this lake were to be aggressively aerated. And then the fourth misconception is a lot of studies will just look at the short-term parking, if you will, phosphorus that is easily released. The problem with this lake is a lot of your what we call refractory phosphorus is bound up in salts that can be released, and if we don't consider those millions of pounds, we'll never get a good handle on the load. So, as Mike said, there is no silver bullet. There is no quick silver bullet for this. We have to rely on the science.
That's great. So what does that mean? In terms of the path forward here, so this is, in essence, the recommended plan that we put together to go forward with. You'll see that the first part of the recommended plan is what we call a design refinement phase. And that's where, with what we learned in this particular phase of work, there's still some additional work to do to understand all this, kind of some of the surprises we got from the watershed. And so this particular thing here, what we're talking about here is looking at, if we talk about working from the bottom up here, first starting with the internal load control. So first step is to design this, and so what we've done as part of this is we've proposed and worked with Nathan, Mayor, and Toomey to look at the next phase, to go out there. What we're proposing is in the next month or two, go out on the ice, drill through the ice. What we want to do is we want to map where the soft sediments are. We think the best thing to do is to get those sediments out of there with the dredging project. We don't know exactly what the volume is today, and so that's what we're proposing to do, is go out, drill through the ice, use a dual beam sonar where we can map the soft versus the hard sediments. Let's go out there and let's get a volume of those sediments so we know how many there are. We're hoping that's in the neighborhood based upon sedimentation rates, based upon lake bathymetry rates, and that's one of the things we're dealing with here is there's a lot of data over the past that jumps around everything from bathymetry to lake size, to watershed size, concentrations. There's a lot of data that jumps around, but the best we can tell, hopefully we're dealing with that 50, 60 to 80,000 cubic yard dredging project. Hopefully that's what we're looking at. So we would look at that and say how best to do that. There's different types of dredging, hydraulic dredging, mechanical dredging. And then what we would do is we were getting those, instead of trying to chemically work with all those different levels of the parking lot, let's just go out there and get rid of them. Let's get rid of them soft sediments. Let's get down to the original hard pan of the lake, because we know that this lake can survive with its existing hard pan, its existing soils, for at least some period of time, right? And that's just kind of a common sense approach to this. We knew when they first built it, they still had high phosphorus soils, and lots of high phosphorus water was coming down. But we still enjoyed generations of reasonable / acceptable water quality. So we know that that's a start. That would probably be a good time to probably seal in the rest of whatever phosphorus is in there to reduce as much of or almost all of the internal loading control as possible. Yes, ma'am.
Could you just describe dredging
You bet.
a little bit better?
You bet. Dredging in essence is just simply removing dirt from the lake. And so,
Leaving the, take from under the water, you're
yes,
not gonna drain the lake, you just dredge it out from what's there.
so the two most common forms of dredging are hydraulic dredging, which you do from a barge. So we can go out there with a barge and we can grab the sediments with basically a cutter head on the bottom of a suction hose. You pump it out, you pump it into a holding basin, you let it settle, you pump the clean water back into the clean river water back into the lake, and you remove it like that. But there also is mechanical dredging. Mechanical dredging is when you have opportunities to drain the lake. You go in and drain the lake. The advantages of each, it just depends on what the situation is. There's advantages of mechanical dredging, there's advantages of hydraulic dredging. There's cost advantages, there's technical advantages, there's permitting advantages. The nice thing about mechanical dredging is that you can see physically where it is. With hydraulic dredging, you're usually relying on computers that are sitting you're working with that are telling you how hard it's working. You can be a lot more fine-tuned with mechanical dredging, but sometimes it just isn't feasible. So that's part of what we talked about, is just looking at both hydraulic and mechanical dredging to go out and get those sediments. And once we know a little bit more about where those sediments are, how far they dispersed across the lake, you can also look at things like lake segmentation, coffer dams. We can only drain a little bit of the lake. When you did the riser modification, the dam risers, the spillway modification project years ago, they built a coffer dam around it and left the lake water high. So there's also ways you could do that. You could do a combination of mechanical and hydraulic. So that's our proposals. Let's get rid of those ultra high phosphorus nutrient-ridden soft sediments, that's number one. Probably at that same time, if we did mechanical dredging, we could hit it with an alum, a dry alum, where you could spread, which is a lot cheaper. If you do hydraulic dredging, you follow another whole lake alum process. Then what you got is you got lake bed that isn't giving you any phosphorus. You're going to have the cleanest lake you all have ever seen, like Mitchell, without a doubt. The question is, how long is it going to last? And the answer is, when's it going to rain next? Because when it rains next, you're going to have a bunch of high phosphorus soils, or it rains coming down and mixing with your bathtub again. And that's going to, ultimately, the lake's going to take on the diluted concentration of where the lake was and what's coming down. Yes, sir.
Is the sediment at the bottom of the lake toxic? What do you do with the soil once you dredge? Where does it go? We're selling dirt and Mitchell for $200 for a pickup load. Is this stuff good? Is it bad? Does it have to be disposed of in a way that is sanitary? Where does it go?
Yeah, we would definitely want a lot, but Charles and I were just in Illinois a couple weeks ago, and they made the comment that they went out, they built this nice stockpile of all this stuff they dredged, and it rained, and it all came back to the lake. So you got to find a way to secure it, stabilize it, put it in a place. Can it be used in different spots? Could it be spread on farm ground? I mean, there's different uses depending on what exactly is the makeup of it. And so right now, part of this whole internal loading comes from some of this work you may be aware we did a couple winters ago, where we went down, drilled through guys and did what we call sediment core sampling. So at that time, we weren't quite aware of the diversity of the nature of the sediments, et cetera. And so we're proposing to do that again and take a lot more tests on it. That's going to help answer that question.
So you can't answer that question?
Oh, no, I can answer the question. I mean, is it toxic? It's not toxic to the point where, it's not nuclear, but it is regulated how you dispose of it, stabilize it.
Because I'm looking at like the Fullerton properties, and I see them bringing in thousands of tons of dirt to fill in an old wetland.
Yeah.
Okay?
So here's one of the problems with dredge material. If we think about how sediments deposit in a lake, they deposit in like particle sizes, and so all the bigger particles, the sand settles out and right in the same area, and the clays silts move a little further down, the clays make a little further. So one of the problems with dredge material is it doesn't have a lot of structural value, because it's usually, when you're grabbing sediment, it's all the same particle size. So it's like trying to compact marbles. You don't have that cohesiveness in sediment. Now, as far as what the toxicity is and how that works, that just depends on ultimately what the use of it is for.
I think what I'm trying to get at is the cost of transportation of stuff like this, especially when you're dredging. You're stirring up the bottom of your dredging, so it's going to go back into the water column. I'm looking at what the cost is, and I see your estimates, and I don't think they even touch what it would be to dispose of the sludge and everything else. And, my question is I have to go, and I don't know anything, but there was a question asked back in 2008 when they did the school. Why don't we put a plug in the bottom? But the cost was $60,000, and I look at $60,000 today, and I sit here and think, you're idiots.
Well, that's part of what we've recommended, is putting in a little more drawing.
Bypass and going around Lake Mitchell and stuff. We have a bypass. It's called the Firestone Creek. We put a bottom, take out the bottom of the dam, let the water drain out of the lake. It's a 5-year solution probably, but then at least you're dealing with dry dirt for the most part, with dry years. And I know most of the people sitting here that have houses around the lake. Our lake is disgusting right now. If it took 5 years to have my kids to have access to a clean lake and people that can eat fish out of it, I'm willing to wait 5 years, but to spend all this money to do all of this stuff, which I'm a science guy, I believe everything you're saying. But I think that the simple solution has to be simple for this community, because I don't think we can afford this.
Okay, thank you. A lot of you said it's a good point. That part of the dredging project, one of the advantages of mechanical dredging and draining the lake is that we can do what probably should have done back then, is put a low port for drawdown. In the spillway, there's a lot of advantages that come with that. As you mentioned, it's probably not going to cost $60,000 today, but what it is going to cost is going to be pretty reasonable for the value I think you get out of it. So,
kind of to tag along with what he's saying with the plug, one of the misconceptions that you mentioned was the fact that aerating is just going to bring all of this phosphorus up. Well, if you're going to dredge it, you're going to take it somewhere. So if we can find your solution or another company's solution that can aerate it, treat the biology with biology, and get that phosphorus moving. I mean, obviously, we've got 375,000 acres of watershed that's putting 48% of phosphorus into the lake. Why couldn't we have aeration and things like that that's going to move 48 or 50% of that phosphorus water column out of the lake, because it's going somewhere already anyway? Why not keep it rolling? I don't want to pass our problem to our neighbor downstream, don't get me wrong. But we're doing it already. Every time you see those numbers where the values where the water is flowing over the top of the spillway 3 to 4 feet high. So what's the difference? We can treat it a lot better. We can treat upstream, we can treat the lake, and we can treat downstream with biology versus biology and filtration stuff. Probably a lot cheaper, along with that same concept of a plug.
So I understand your input. That's why we tried to address that problem. Our opinion is that it's just not possible with what we're dealing with here. It's apples and oranges and some of the successes I think that particular application's had in the past. Be happy to discuss that with you in detail sometime. That's our opinion, is that we're giving you the minimum of what it's going to take to do it right and do it in long term.
Is phosphorus worth anything?
Well, you buy it to fertilize your grass, but buying it in
Is
different.
ours worth anything? That all this phosphorus that's laying on the bottom of the lake, is it worth anything? Is it good for anything?
There are programs where they've used the phosphorus and reused it for some different things. Yeah.
So we could like dig it up and make money off of it?
Well, I wish it was that
Hand
easy.
it over to you and say, here we go?
So there are some opportunities where you can at least try to minimize some of your costs with that. You're not going to get. I've never seen a project where you're going to get it to pay for yourself.
No.
But even if it can help subsidize some of those costs, that's a good thing. Once we have a better understanding of what kind of some of the phosphorus, what form it's in, and how much of it is in each form, then some of those questions can be answered. There are projects, and Charles has done a little bit of research on this one, with, could you possibly use that for some different applications? So we're getting near the end, and some of the questions are getting big picture, they're good questions, but Timmy, you want to say something before we finish up?
I simply want to clarify this, the time frame on it. We were to do a hydrographic survey of the lake sediment, and you go through the ice to get those core samples. And say you go with mechanical dredging, and you do completely drain the lake. What's the time frame from the time you drain it, clean it, fill it back up again?
Well, as we said, in terms of refilling, so it's everything's a function of money. You can make things happen very quickly when there's money to be spent. And so there's the things that would affect the time frame of permitting, and the regular design and permitting, and then get the construction done. It doesn't take all that long to empty the lake. And as we know, it doesn't take all that long to refill the lake. So our goal would be in a dredging project to start it right after the beginning of the recreation season. If you have, hopefully you have a recreation season, this next year, but it could be ready as early as September-ish. That's the best time, because the lake use starts dwindling down, and the rain obviously doesn't hit as often on an average basis in the fall as it does in the spring. So getting things done in the winter and working on a frozen lake bed is actually good for contractors. That's a lot better than a squishy lake bed. So I think if you did a project in the fall and the winter and you got it buttoned up, you can make anything happen in a short amount of time depending on what kind of contractor you select. If we get to the point where we have a project that's just too big for any local guys, and you got to bring in a local or a national firm, then sometimes that costs you a little bit of money. But that's the decision you make to say, I don't want the lake down for a whole other year. But having a lake open for a spring runoff season doesn't make a whole lot of sense either, because we know it's going to refill once, maybe twice. And so I would think that the best thing to do would be to drain it right after Labor Day, let it dry out for a month, and then go to work and have it done before spring rains hit. That would be my goal as far as that dredging project. So I just got a little bit left here. So after the dredging project we talked about, remove those sediments. I think if we did a dredging project, I think it would make sense to put in a low flow. We're starting to get low or down in time. So I'm gonna push that off and let you read about some of that in the TM. But we talked about putting a low port in the riser so you could manipulate the lake level in the future while the lake's down. You can still do hydraulic dredging, build a coffer dam and build that low flow. But if you're gonna drain the lake and you're gonna do dredging and you're gonna put that in, it might make sense to do it all together. And so we talked about that in the TM there. The next big part of this project that we're proposing is to have a detention basin at the head of the lake. And so, based upon some of the numbers we've done, there's a lot of discussion in the TM about this. We're talking about building a detention basin that may hold about as much water, or a little bit more, than Lake Mitchell holds in itself. And the reason for that is that we want to be able to capture that water, release it slowly, and treat it before it gets into the lake. That ability to capture that volume of water can also allow us to have some wetland complexes and some other natural processes that will work great in lower concentrations of phosphorus, help clean up some of that water before it reaches Lake Mitchell. We can also use that to help supplement low water times in Lake Mitchell. So there's a lot of value in that and what we can do with it. We also talked about the bypass system, started talking about it, and that was to say, if we looked at something like that, so we talked about building a detention basin that maybe hold up to 10,000 acre-feet of water, and we get 25,000 acre-feet a year. So water's still going to come through there at certain times. But if we can treat it slowly, it's easier than treating it once it gets in the lake. And the bypass system would be something where if we found out that some of those things, it still wasn't quite enough, and we don't have all of those answers today perfectly. And so part of what we've proposed for this coming year as part of the design, what we call the design refinement phase, is to get some of those answers. We know a lot better than we knew 15 months ago what questions to ask ourselves. And all that's laid out in detail in the TM. Yes, sir?
We keep moving the cart further and further down the line. You just said, well, it'll take another year to get this going and have that. When are we gonna cut bait, start getting things done with it? What's the point where we can start something?
Are you asking me?
In some ways, I mean, you wanna do some more analysis and
So-
things like that.
Can you give me 3 more slides and I've got that answer? Okay. So then we got, so this detention cell we believe is an integral part of this project. It's gonna be necessary. We gotta have another line of defense against the watershed. Okay. The bypass system, we're hoping that through this design refinement phase, we get to the point where we can figure out how to make this work without having to do the bypass system. Part of what we're doing and part of what we plan is going out to Watershed and collecting some additional information. Okay, no one's collected that information to date. We're also going to look a lot more at finding out what it is. Now we know that there's, with all the dissolved phosphorus, there's a lot coming from some soils. But there's also a possibility that we could still go into the watershed a little bit better, find some hot spots in other areas that are contributing more than others, and alter our plan a little bit to deliver less nutrients down from the watershed. And that's what's proposed. So ultimately, our hope is that we've shown this bypass as part of kind of the third leg of that system. Hopefully what we find out in the meantime is we get smarter and smarter and smarter with more data, that we're able to eliminate some of the tail end and some of the more expensive parts of that system. But otherwise what the bypass does is takes water from that detention system, pumps it around the lake, maybe through a low port in the spillway or just over the spillway, pumps it downstream so it doesn't mix with Lake Mitchell. And so ultimately the timing of all of these has to work together. We know that in essence we recreate from Memorial Day to Labor Day, with, you know, the 4th of July being around the peak of the season. That's also the very start of the end of the rains, right? And so we're trying to find a way with the timing of everything, when the rains come, when is treatment possible? How do we make the lake react the way we want so that we can use it when we want? We don't really care if phosphorus concentrations are high in January, right? I mean, it's not really going to affect ice fishing that much. You're not going to grow algae. And so let's just focus on an answer that gets us to where we can use the lake during the recreation season. And there's a big graph that kind of explains all of this. It's a bunch of different colors in the TM. I encourage you to read, because that's really the basis for our design. And what we've come up with is we feel that that's one of the least expensive ways to get there and do it and start building a solution. So while we looked at strategy 1, and we said we can go out and do a dredging project, and we can remove those high phosphorus sediments, and we can come in and seal the rest of the natural sediments on the bottom of the mountain, where now we've got almost reducing our internal load control down to something extremely manageable, closer to nothing than where it is today. And we can still come in and then you can treat the lake every year. You can spend just whatever the dredging project costs. We're hoping it's in the neighborhood of $6 million. Do that project, and then you can come in and right before you want to start using the lake every year, put out in it. You're going to have a beautiful lake. You're going to have a pristine lake. And now the island's going to work. Because now the island is just dripping the water column. And Charles, and maybe Greg used the term water column. The water column is just the depth of the water between the surface of the lake and the heart and the bottom. Call that the water column. There's phosphorus there, and there's phosphorus in the soils. We've already sealed the phosphorus in the soils. All we got to do is we drop that in, we strip it, Alan will work that. Because it didn't just open up an avenue to release all the cars out of the subterranean parking lots to come up. Those are sealed. Alan will work that, and you will have a great lake until it rains again. And that's why that solution doesn't have a sustainable component of it, and why we've worked with these near lake solutions with hopefully, I'm in hope that we can do this and just use the detention cell. But as of today, I can't promise you it's not going to require putting in the bypass as well. But what we do know is if you do both of those, we got a much better chance of being able to handle the project, react, as sort of an adaptive management to lake management to get it to where we can use it, which is what we're shooting for here. Get it to the point where we can use it when we want to use it. We are not going to build a northern Minnesota pristine, crystal clear lake you can see 30 foot down year round. That's never going to happen. But let's get it to the point where we can use it for what it's intended to be used for between Memorial Day and Labor Day especially. So with that, to answer some of the other questions that came up there, that strategy, that current strategy there shows what that looks like. And so these little tines, when that hump is above the blue line there, that's that maintenance cost where we say we go out and we can strip the water column. We go out and apply on to that, strip the water column, that's gone. That's coming down. You're not going to have algae. So that's what part of the maintenance cost of that is. So I really am getting close to the end here. So this is kind of some of the project cost and what we need there. So we've laid this project cost. I'm going to start dissecting this a little bit, talk about schedule in a little bit here. So some of the costs of the watershed, we talked about, let's do everything we can to promote the work that the agencies are doing in the watershed. Let's keep them doing that. If they can reduce those flows and reduce the nutrient content of those flows, it's going to help us from the standpoint down the road there. So let's be an advocate to get that watershed coordinator. Nathan wrote an excellent application last year. The application fell short in terms of getting one funded. But I think now with all the work you're doing, and if this city's committed to moving forward on this project, I think it's going to look a lot different to the people who are doing this. Because I can tell you when I first started this project, I met with the state, and the state told me, hey, we've heard from Mitchell before. Yep, they started, they don't follow through. You showing you have a plan to follow through and finance it? I think they're going to look different on those kind of opportunities. So when we look at the total cost of this internal load control project, which includes the cost of the bypass system, a couple things I want to address real quick is when we do things at a planning level, I don't even like putting things on a map with this. We showed a map. I don't even like putting things on a map because you start saying, oh, that's my lake. Well, there's other places to put things, but in terms of seeing scale, in terms of determining feasibility, we did put things on a map. It doesn't mean it has to be right there today. But there's other uncertainties as well. So we've shown the major components of the project there, where we build a detention system that has an alum injection place, where we clean the water when we release it from the detention cell, the dredging project, the detention cell at the top, bypass system. We've got a contingency in there. And so part of this cost is a big contingency. And so our job as we refine design is to reduce costs as we go. Hopefully we get smarter. But in the meantime, we put something in there for unknowns. So we do have $4 million in there for unknowns. We've also got a very hefty engineering, again, at a planning level, screening alternatives, there's also a very hefty fee in there for consulting services. And so that's just to address the unknowns. As we go through, there's less unknowns. I can promise you can get a lot of this done for less than that. So our goal is to turn that 30, hopefully, into closer to 20, and maybe it's 25, I don't know. Part of that's going to get refined in the next year. We're going to know a lot more if we choose to move forward with the project there. In terms of the schedule there, so what we've done in terms of also the team is develop some cost reduction strategies there. We've identified what data we need here. And so we asked the question was asked, we just keep on pushing things down the road. When are we going to do something here? We are proposing another year of sampling. Because now we've got better questions to answer. You've never, to this date, looked past all your old studies. They're more general. You don't have a study like you have now that answers some of these questions, that also creates some questions. And so if we want to refine costs, I can promise you that every dollar you spend refining costs, we're going to save you 3 or 4 down the road. That's the purpose of this and what we've laid out. And so this is some of the data needs we have. And in terms of the design refinement, we're going to relook at those internal load control measures after we map sediments, retest those sediments, look at what those are, and then optimizing all the performance for the dollars spent. And then ultimately, we want to also reduce your ongoing O&M costs as part of that as well. And so this is straight out of the TM section 9, page 64. This answers your question, I hope, sir. This tells exactly what we can do. We've proposed to the city the next phase, which is to go out on the ice, to start out on the ice here in the next month or so, drill through the ice, map the soft sediments so we know where they are, how many of them there are, test the soft sediments so we know where that is. Then we can begin tying down that number on that dredging project to figure out how much it's really going to cost to do what we want to do. Look at hydraulic versus mechanical. Look at those different things as part of the dredging project and come up with ready to do that. We can get that thing designed and ready for you to do this fall. If that's where you want to move forward, that's something you got to decide. Money's going to affect everything here. And so this is one of the most important parts here is we looked at that. So design refinement early 2018. We also need to start working with that outside. I haven't got to talk about outside funding, but I'm getting there. And so also beginning to talk about outside funding. How do we start looking for that money to help us pay for this project? Then we got phase 4, which as early as this summer, end of the summer, what I call the phase 2 implementation. So dredging and then potential riser modifications. So the low-level drawdown of the riser and the possibility for hooking a bypass into the riser, or both of them as one. If we decided that we had to come back for the bypass later. So that could be done as early as be ready to go for Labor Day, after Labor Day, if you want to do that. Phase 5 is to be determined because we don't know exactly what 5 is going to be in terms of detention, bypass, etc., until we get, for sure, phase 2 and 3 done, so we understand what's potentially affordable in terms of bringing in outside money, and what technically is going to work based upon what we learned in that phase as well. So this is all spelled out as far as when it can happen. The only thing holding back is money. That's the only thing. So when you look at these costs and when they would be spent along with those, I'm just going to go through real quick here. So design refinement phase, of course, takes some money. We've given the city a proposal on what that would take for the next step. The next phase is the grant funding pursuit, which would also just be a little bit of that money that's said there just to meet. They've also identified District 3 to work with them, who has a lot better handle on local grant funding. We would do that, support them technical information, whatever we could do to help with that. Again, we're still in very affordable phases for this next phase of the project. When we get into phase 3, that's the next real big commitment in terms of money. And so we've got the dredging project shown on there, part of the contingencies of the dredging project, and then some of the engineering of the dredging project. The design of it's included in 1, but then there would just be some construction observation that would come out of that till as well in phase 3. We move on to phase 4, optimize it your lake solutions. So that's to go back in and say, okay, now with all the information we have, we got new information about the phosphorus, the watershed, what can we do now to optimize that last big step, which is that near lake solution there. And of course, funding that is the last part, number 5, that would come out of all that. We'll hopefully get to the point where we've reduced some of these costs and hopefully eliminated that one. But we don't know if that's possible today. So all those are again laid out in that. When we talk about funding here, so when we've done these projects in the past, the biggest difference in this project and the projects that we've worked on in the past is that dissolved phosphorus component. A lot of times the watershed, most of these projects that you'll read, the watershed is a lot, especially in reservoirs, not so much in natural lakes, but reservoirs, the watershed's a lot more responsible for the problems. And the tricky part of that with Mitchell is that that's not what's contributing to all of your problems there. And you have a huge watershed. And as Sarah discussed before, you've got, the producers are doing a good job. You've got a very low sediment yield per acre. The problem is there's just 350,000 acres. That's the problem. You can't go out and beat up farmers and say you're not doing a good job. They are doing a good job. We do have low sediment yield. Doesn't mean there's not improvements that can be made, but in most reservoir projects and agricultural communities, most of the outside funding comes from NRCS through the Farm Bill, et cetera, where you're out there putting terraces, waterways, bank stabilization, and all those things that reduce sediment. We're not getting a ton of the sediment here. We can't blame farmers because they farm in high phos soils that are part of the James Low. But there are things we could do in the watershed still to improve that, and we want to dial those in. But that's the trickiest part, is going in and saying, outside funding in past projects we usually work on, NRCS is happy to go out of these watersheds and help people put practices on the ground. Yes, sir.
I understand it right. We've never run into a lake like Lake Mitchell, and there's never been a solution that we can go to and say it worked there similar to that.
Well, I'll tell you that you said never twice, which I'm not going to agree to. I'll tell you that every lake project is different. Every lake project is unique in terms of what you're dealing with.
So
This one's
what lake
especially
would be
unique.
similar to ours that have been solved with this solution?
You're not going to find that.
So if that's the case, this is a unique solution. Who would you recommend the city go to for a second opinion before we spend $30 million or drain the lake? Which both seem like huge expenditures
Right.
based on a $70,000 study.
There's not a whole lot of people, we don't have a whole lot of competition who do what we do, but there are firms out there who would probably be happy to take a look at this proposed solution and tell you if they think it's in the, the realm of reasonableness. I'd be happy to give those names to the city. Yeah. So that's a valid question. So when we look at that, so that's one of the tricks here, is we came from the very start, we said, number one, here's what's got to happen. So the EPA Section 319 program, let's talk about that real quick. We've used that on almost every lake restoration project that we've done, almost every one. This is what they do. They look at impaired water bodies. They take solutions that they can apply that show that we can reach a reduction. That's what the purpose of this Section 319 program is. So every state takes federal money and they disperse the money as they see fit. And so what we found out, talking early on when we first got started on this project in South Dakota, is that a lot of times what they do is they take that money and they put it into the watershed. They put it into the watershed, they put it into farm practices. And it's not that that doesn't happen in Iowa and Nebraska and other states that we work in, but they do focus a lot on in-lake or near-lake solutions to projects as well. Whereas in South Dakota, typically all their money's gone into watershed coordination. Let's tackle the problem at the source. And there's a valid strategy to that. There's no doubt about it. All we're saying, when we started this study, what we said to you was, if you're willing to accept that, then you're never going to see an answer in your lifetime. You can work in that watershed, and even if things ramp up 20 times, you'd have to ramp up things 20 times maybe in terms of the efforts and the things that are getting on the ground in your watershed to get it where you're going to see them in your lifetime. Whereas in some of the other states when we worked in, where they were able to invest a little bit closer to the lake, we can go out there and now we can make something happen where you can start seeing things happen. We still want to see things in the watershed. So to do that, we've got to go to the state and we've got to convince them that we've got a plan here. And we got to shift the way they think. There's no doubt about it. But I'll promise you right now, and everybody in South Dakota has got to be involved in this, because every lake in South Dakota that's facing the similar problems to Mitchell is going to be dealing with this. You're going to have friends. You're going to have people who are in your court to help support this. And it's a state, game official told us very early on, why are you worried about Mitchell? There's a lot more lakes in worse shape than that. And it's just the nature of the beast. One of the things I thought was very shocking when we first started this project, and I said, 524 to 1 watershed to lake erosion, that's crazy. In Nebraska, it gets about 80, 90. Nebraska gets about 80 to 90. You start saying, boy, that's going to be tough to fix the water quality. You're at 524 to 1. But then we get into the data, we find out the lake doesn't even stay full. The watershed yield is so low here. We thought them old timers are crazy. Why'd they build such a small lake? Now we know why. Because you had to build it to keep it full. It's just a unique problem. And right now, in my opinion, the first thing we needed to go to Section 319, the state of South Dakota, and say, look, we got a plan. The plan feasibility-wise works, but we need their commitment. And so, bit of a paradigm shift in terms of outside funding. And so that's why some of what we propose in terms of moving forward is, you know, the dredging part of this, the internal load control, in terms of normal funding, is probably the last thing that you're going to get outside funding for. Almost impossibility. With all the things they're willing to spend money on, almost an impossibility. But what it does, it shows City of Mitchell's commitment to moving forward, to starting a project, and starting to work to try to bring in these other things, saying, we're going to do our part. We need to find a solution that works, not only for this lake, but other South Dakota lakes that are in the same, you know, problem. And that's what we need to start doing next, and start working on that. And so to work with all these, local funding. Obviously, a lot of this is going to have to be funded by the city itself. We'll go to bat for you and work hard with you, your grant writers, District 3, to try to get a little bit of a shift of thinking and saying, let's try a project. Mitchell's committed to it now. If you are, let's try a project and let's see if this works. Because ultimately, the value to South Dakota is a heck of a lot more than sharing $10 million with regards to tourism and everything else that it does for the natural resources in the state. It's worth a heck of a lot more than what we're going to be asking for if we can come up with a project that works. And we believe we have. So, last thing I want to talk about real quick is there's been a couple of misconceptions out there and some information around that's not necessarily what was intended as part of, I think, the community-based planning process got hijacked a little bit and some things got distributed that probably shouldn't at the right time. It's just a matter of sharing information, whatever. And so what I want to show is that, and I'm not talking about the articles themselves, and especially the titles of the articles, but I want to talk about some of the stuff that's in some of the articles here. So again, we talked about this earlier, 3 projects which range in price from $6 to $81 million. Not true. Not what was ever intended. It was a geographic strategy. We've got some different costs in the watershed. We've got to blend them to make a project. Here we talked about city finance 40% of that cost, 60% coming from grants or other funding. And very early on, we made it very clear. You know, 60 is the number for the eligible cost components that we've used on past lake project based upon federal funding ratios. I just got done talking to you all about what we have to do to go make sure we've convinced those people to invest in the same way they have on other lake projects there. Okay, here we talk about the Allen. We talk about Mitchell tried to approach about a decade ago to no avail, and that's absolutely true. It didn't work a decade ago. We talked a lot tonight about why it probably didn't work. In fact, why back then it wouldn't have worked for sure. So again, we answered the solution to that. But that $6 million is the most affordable plan. It's not. That's not the cost of the plan. That plan by itself doesn't do it. So we want to make sure everybody understood it. No one's saying this $6 million project is going to fix this. Last part here was skeptical of projects. The 60% of the restoration cost funded through grants from the state, federal again. So we talked about that. But at the end, we talked about some are critical. And that's fair to be critical at this point. We do have work to do. We've analyzed that, and we've said that over and over and over. It's got to be a paradigm shift of thinking up here in how we do these projects and how we participate with the agencies that do these particular projects. We've shown you why focusing on the watershed first doesn't work for you. It's a sustainable solution, but if we're developing sustainable solutions for our grandkids and great-grandkids, that's fine. But it doesn't work for any of you. Okay, last part here I want to talk about is the do-nothing alternative. And so you have an opportunity to do nothing. And so ultimately, what we've shown here is this is the graph that's in the TM here. What we've shown is that ultimately, if we put the same data in the model and extrapolate that out to 2030, we're just going to see nothing but increasing phosphorus levels. There's no reason there wouldn't be, right? I mean, we're going to do the same thing, let the lake continue to age, and it's not going to fill in with sediment, we know very quickly. So it's just going to continue to grow and collect more and more phosphorus every year. So we can see an upward trend line every year of what gets processed through there. That's what's going to happen. So long-term water quality is just going to get worse. Quality of living is going to continue to decline at the lake in terms of lake use and what that brings to your city. Property values, of course, aren't going to do any better around the lake or in the city with the lake continuing to decline, no investment in it. And then lastly, if someone ever does, this is not a linear relationship in terms of cleaning these things up, which is one of the reasons we're sitting here 90 years later and talking about a $20 to $30 million project right now that a lot of people think is unaffordable. What's it gonna be, how's it gonna be for your kids? And so if we do nothing, the restoration cost for future generations is gonna go up and up and up and up and up. So, with that is the end of all the information there. What we said we were. So, we're again happy to take any questions now. One second, man, we're happy to take any questions now. But what we're also gonna do is Sarah and I are gonna stay in this room and talk about next steps and what the recommended plan is in funding. Right across the hall in room 111, Charles and Greg are going to be over there to talk about chemistry. We're going to ask questions about chemistry, sediment stuff, modeling, etc. Yep, so we're going to start setting up. And if there's any questions for the good of the group, happy to take
I
them.
just have one question. You had made mention that we are so unique. Are there any other, when we approach the state of South Dakota, are there any other lakes in South Dakota that somebody's saying, oh, geez, so-and-so's got this lake that's got all these problems, and then there's Lake Mitchell that's got these problems. Who else besides us are these lakes that are in bad shape?
I don't, Charles, do you remember off the TMDL and the 303 impaired bodies list what some of the other local lakes are? There are dozens.
Oh, okay. I just asked. I didn't know if anybody else was trying to solve these problems that we could, take their brains or what.
And that's a great question, man. But one thing I forgot to mention with regards to funding is that there's a little bit of a value in being unique, because I would say that in terms of, there are grants out there called like CIG, Conservation Innovation Grants from NRCS. Those grants sometimes are looking for someone who has a unique approach or someone who's trying to do something different to help other people. So there is some value in that with regards to the project in terms of grant pursuit. So any other questions for the good of the group? Yes, sir.
Explain if there's other nutrients in the lake that you found that are a problem with nitrogen or whatever, and why phosphorus is the bad one.
Greg, or you want to handle that real quick before we go?
Yeah.
He's going to I'll give you an answer. Greg will give you a better answer.
Sure. For folks in here, man, for the sake of time, there are other nutrients that come into play in all living systems. All living systems use nitrogen, they use sulfur, they use trace nutrients, but phosphorus is the limiting reagent. So we pay attention to the nutrient that is most likely to spur growth. And there are some systems that are pretty rare where you have nitrogen limited, but almost all lakes are phosphorus limited, and that's typically the driver for the algal blooms.
You mentioned early on that we're still going to have algae blooms because of the runoff throughout the year. There are lakes in Minnesota that are not an ideal situation where they are treated with chemicals for 50 plus years. Is there any value to supplementing this project with chemical treatment to reduce algae bloom at certain times of the year or for certain periods of the year for recreation?
So let's remember that algal blooms are happen in healthy lakes, and it's part of the natural system that doesn't necessarily need to go away 100%. And so what we want to do is get to the point where it's manageable, and when the bloom's gone, you're not left with a bucket of pea soup that stinks. Blooms come and go, they die off, it's part of the natural process. And so there are chemicals, but those chemicals in high phosphorus situations can have negative effects on how the lake chemistry works. And now, Greg, you want to expand on that anyway?
Yeah, there's a variety of different applications. You can try to do copper sulfate, for example, but that can raise toxicity concerns in the lake. Copper is not particularly good for fish. It also adds a lot of sulfate, which is not particularly good for the lake bed system, because sulfate binds up iron sites that you need for binding up phosphorus. So there's alum applications. They work better in Minnesota because the glacial flows that went through Minnesota went over hard granite or hard rocks. Whereas here in eastern South Dakota, the old James River lowland is from the glaciers carving out through the pure shales. If you ever, when you cross over the river, you see all those black sediments. Those were old marine sediments from the dinosaur days, 65 million and they're just chock full of phosphorus, and that's what we're dealing with in eastern South Dakota. And that's why we're so much different from, say, a Minnesota or Wisconsin.
Okay, so in the back, sorry, what is it, in the back next to Anna there are some comment cards. If anybody has anything they want to make sure gets addressed as part of this, we'll be happy to address any comments. Sorry, you had a question? Does the high phosphorus yield more of a risk for fish kill? Well, it's certainly going to limit some species here. It actually might create a better environment for some other species, with regards to what kind of fish you want, what kind of oxygen they need. But with its play on the oxygen in the water is going to have the biggest effect on the fishery in terms of what species are going to be able to thrive in that environment.
The phosphorus itself is not toxic, but it can create conditions such as very low dissolved oxygen, which can cause problems for more sensitive species.
Yes, sir.
If you dredge the lake, you'll be putting it back to about the same condition it was in 1927 when it was built.
Probably.
If you do it correctly.
If we do it
nothing else, then it would get bad at about the same rate it did from 1927 to 1977.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So is it feasible that you just have a plan that every 50 years you drain it and dredge it?
Well, that's certainly something that you can do, and that's why we've included some of those operation and maintenance costs in the plans, is that it probably makes sense, as we know today, to at least start putting towards a rainy day fund. I think ultimately when we get to the end result, if you have a detention cell, my guess is that you're going to be able to do all your sediment removal there at much less cost than doing it in the lake. So ultimately, I think the answer to your question is going to be a function of the final product. Hopefully the detention cell allows them to do just that. It's really reduce the amount of sediment that ever does make it in, and we don't have to deal with that. We can remove them high phos sediments from the detention cell inexpensively versus the lake more expensive. Yes, sir.
So going back to his question, if the phosphorus, if you, I'll call it, illuminate the phosphorus that's going through in that injection system, you would have phosphorus that's more inactive at the bottom of your lake, so it would last a lot longer. Would it be you have to do something or not?
Yes, the aluminum is going to tie up or sequester so much of that phosphorus, make it unavailable. There are conditions that can re-release it later, extreme anoxic conditions, and that's why things like aeration could be a potential solution of a long-term management plan once you get the nutrient concentration down to the point where it will do exactly what you just described. Applying aeration right now is not going to discourage anoxic conditions. It's going to liberate more phosphorus from the base sediments.
But yeah, the watershed work, the Near Lake project, you implement those, we will have a longer lifetime of the internal load if you reduce the load coming into the lake.
By the way, I just found out that clock's an hour off. I was pretty happy to hear that. That too. Yes, Mayor Tim.
I heard not to do this question here. His question was that if you do this dredging of the lake, they would put the lake back into condition in 1927 or 28 when they first built this lake. I would think that it would last much, much longer because over the last 90 years, a lot of conservation practices that we know now that we didn't know then.
That's
Plus,
true.
we're going to have a holding pond. It seems like to me that the lake will last a lot longer than these past 90 years because of all this technology that we now know and the conservation efforts that we would put into this lake for management going into the future, that it would last a lot longer.
That's absolutely correct. That the conservation practice would slow down the normal sedimentation rate. Also, the fact that it's going to last longer because we would put in as a minimum with the dredging project some way of holding in those base sediments, even what would occur naturally that was occurring then that wasn't planned on. So a combination of those, it's going to last longer. Question is how long? Yes, sir.
Just for a thought, what happens if you dredge the lake and you still have those fire shell source of water and you release the water to the bottom, still there, open the top of the lake? Does that make any difference at all?
So one of the, so did everybody hear the question? No, okay, so I'm going to repeat the question. So let me see if I get this right. So the question was, is if we did look at bypassing, using Firestill Creek and putting some kind of bypass system to
Not
build.
necessarily a bypass, but just dredge the lake.
Okay.
Start a clean lake bed.
Yep.
And then to expand the number of years that it stays clean, release the water through the spillway, the natural way, to the bottom to a floodgate.
Type of like
Through over the top of the floodgate.
Right.
So that, and place the sediment on down the line, that is really neat.
So there's probably not much sediment making it to where you could do that unless you, so in some hypovolcanic situations, you can go out and extend pipes into different parts of the lake and valve it so that you can open it up in different spots. There's probably not enough going where it makes sense to do that. There is actually an old professor, Charles and I, Dr. Alan Hotchkiss actually had a system he called the hydrosuction return system where he would use a siphon to help move sediment. Unfortunately, he was trying to use sand instead of clay and it never worked. But there are systems where they actually look at doing that. Our goal is to try to use that detention zone to grab those sediments. I think that's the best answer.
We did look at that as a potential solution. We only had less than a handful of data points where we knew the phosphorus at the top layer of the lake. At the same time, we had phosphorus concentrations in the bottom layer of the lake. Those handful of data points showed there wasn't a whole lot of difference. That could have been a function of the timing they were taken. It's not enough. So we have actually talked about, as part of the refinement, to do some water column depth sampling to see if we're seeing higher concentrations at the bottom. So it's not to say that's completely off the table, but we didn't have the data to support that. Right.
My experience with Firestill Creek is that we have really one period of the year where we get a large runoff, and after the ground is frozen, and it's snow melt, and it flushes with it, everything laying on top of the ground, comes with it, and that's when we get our biggest runoff again. Once in a while during the summer, we'll get a big rain event, and then those events will carry more sediment to it, and the frozen ground, which is, that's what I just,
That's a good point. That's actually one of the parts that's built into our proposed watershed work this year is to start looking at during runoff events. You think about an urban storm, you always hear about that, they call it the first flush. That first half inch of runoff really carries 90% of the pollutants in an urban situation, right? All the greases and oils and the trash that's sitting on the street. It's one of the things we looked at, is within the watershed, can we expect to see what Charles did have the information says for larger runoff events, some average concentrations. What we want to see is in the hydrograph, is it the leading end of the hydrograph, the middle, or the back? What's carrying the highest concentrations, or is it just, vanilla throughout? So some of what you're talking about is actually what's proposed for this next year to figure out, can we maximize the use of that basin?
But yeah, simply pulling water from the bottom, that's not going to change the concentrations that's coming into your lake. So it might help pull out some of potentially higher phosphorus concentrations on the bottom of the lake due to internal loading, but it's not going to.
Lake Mitchell's mixed pretty well.
Yeah,
one of the reasons being
change
it's small, the watershed's what mixes well. You get deeper lakes that are layered, and that turn a lot more. You can get a lot more layering of some of those different concentrations where hypovolcanic draw and some other applications make a lot more sense. But from as Charles said, with the limited data we've got to date, it doesn't look like that'd be a big game changer or an investment that brings the bang for the buck that we're looking for. Okay, we're gonna stick around. Charles and Greg are gonna be in that room 111. If anybody wants to discuss anything, Sarah and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you all for coming out. You're welcome for us bringing some nice warm weather up for this meeting. Finally got a warm weather meeting.